Hey all, I'm Joel, and I'm a co-founder of 3Box. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about data, DAOs, and things that are as exciting about the future. So, whoops, can I go back? All right, so the question I wanted to address a little bit today is how will DAOs consume data? And when I'm saying this, I'm not referring to like the on-chain voting mechanisms or like the data that's produced by these mechanisms and like how we analyze that. I'm more thinking about the data that comes from the real world and goes through the users of the DAO and then eventually ends up having the people using that information and making decisions. So basically the entire data stream up until the point where people vote in the DAO. So how will DAOs basically consume data? And really this is like a sense-making problem. How do we know that the users are actually consuming the information that best informs the DAO? And it's really the level of the user's ability to make sense of the world is the level of capability the DAO will have to affect the world in the way it wants to affect the world. All right. So what does this really have to do with 3Box? So 3Box is a user-centric data and identity system. So it allows developers to store data with the users, and it allows us to create identities. And by bottom-up identity, what I mean by that is identity is really not something that you get from institution or a government or even a DAO. Like identity really is something that is an emergent property of your interactions with other people, with applications, and the world basically. So that's what we mean by bottoms-up identity. And we want to help like developers actually get there by providing tools with 3Box. So 3Box has 3 main APIs. First one is just profiles, replacing hex addresses on blockchains with like an image and a name and other information. Then we have like a generalized data storage system, so you can store data that the user is ultimately in control of. And the third one is threads, so basically threaded conversations or messaging. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through the anatomy of 3Box. This is basically going to be like a high-level overview of how 3Box works under the hood. Oops. So firstly, we have the 3ID DID method. And a DID method is basically a standard that's proposed by the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And what it is basically like a short string that you can ask a decentralized network and get back a document. And this document can contain public keys. It can for signing and for encryption, and can also contain pointers to other services. And basically what this allows you to do is like verify signatures of users and encrypt data to users. The 3ID method is the 3Box version of this, and we're using it basically to link Ethereum addresses to users' data. And we're also working on making this compatible to other blockchain systems, so it's not only limited to Ethereum. So, well, how is the data stored then? So every entry, like every data that the user adds is signed by this in the user's DID, and it's stored in a linked list. And you can kind of think of this as a personal blockchain in a sense that every update to this user database is a transaction that's signed by the user's private key. And by following this chain of transactions, we can create the state of the user's database. And basically how this works is like each transaction that you see here is basically an IPFS object, and it points to the previous one using its hash. An interesting thing about this is like we don't really have a double spending problem when it comes to like user data. So we can have the history diverge, and then we can simply just merge the history again. So in that sense, it's not like and not exactly like a blockchain, but we can think of it as a similar data structure. And all, like as I said, all of these entries are signed by the user's DAD. So quickly on the architecture of 3Box, like how is data stored in the network? So basically, each application has an instance of IPFS, which is the pure data storage layer, and OrbitDB. And OrbitDB structures the data and creates like a database, and it also replicates the data in the network. So we can maintain a pinning node, and then applications have a copy of the data. And the reason we do this is if the user logs into a different device, or if they were to lose their device, when they recover their key material, they can always recover the data. So if this is basically just making sure that users can have access to the data, and that like you have some security in that. And lastly, messaging and discussions. So the thread feature of 3Box is basically similar to the general data storage that I talked about earlier, but here we can have multiple users adding messages to the same data structure. And basically, that's it. Like you have multiple users signing messages. And the cool thing that we're doing here is that we can actually have moderation and like different user levels. So members can post to a thread, and we can have moderators that can remove posts and like make sure like that we have credible data in these threads. Right. So what does this have to do with DAOs? Well, I'd like to bring forth like an example, and by asking a question. So, is reputation only like a number that exists on chain? Because in most DAO systems, we only have a number on chain that represents your reputation, and that's used to give you power. Like how much influence do you have when you vote? And I mean that works, but like, is that the only thing? So I'd like to give an example of like how 3Box has helped different projects, and basically like how something we're calling soft reputation actually can help blockchain applications be more like understandable by normal users. And so the first example is Moloch DAO. And in Moloch DAO, like when you first had the proposals, you only had like a hex address that were like the kind of grantee that got the reputation in DAO, and that's like really difficult to understand, like, or at a glance understand who would get this the benefits of this proposal. So having like a profile in there makes it a lot like easier to like understand quickly if that's like an actual person that should get this funding maybe. Another example that's a little bit more descriptive maybe of why this is useful is Foam. So Foam is like a mapping system. They have a token curated registry where people can add locations to a decentralized map. And in their system, people can basically vote if it's going to be part of the map or not. And they had this problem where they had this one address that kept saying like, hey, this, like voting no on a bunch of things. So they thought like, is this user only griefing our system? And after they like actually implemented our profiles, they could see like very easily at just a glance that this user is actually also voting yes on a bunch of stuff. So it's just like easier to digest the user interface when you have some kind of soft social reputation systems. And I think once we take this further than just profiles, you can actually see some like who's commented on what, who has like interacted with which proposals. You can make this kind of soft reputation a lot more powerful, and you can use the kind of at a glance view to get a much better sense of the people that are interacting in your DAO. So I think this is like one of the first pieces we can use to create something I'm calling sense-making Legos. So I'm borrowing the word Legos from the DeFi movement. So DeFi, basically there's like a lot of talk about these financial Lego bricks in the blockchain space right now. And basically what that is that you have different pieces of fintech things that you can like put together without any permissions. So examples like you use ETH to create CDPs, which you can create DAI. You can use DAI to create CDAI, which earns interest, and then you can use RDAI to point that interest to another person. And like all of this is like Lego bricks that you can use to build without asking for permission in from the creators. So I think we actually need to start to create these types of Lego bricks, but for sense making, basically allowing users of DAO to get a sense of like what's happening in the world, so that they can be better informed when they're voting in DAOs, which is like a thing that I think is really important, because if people are mostly interacting in today's social networks and then they are interacting in DAOs, the social networks or the systems that they're interacting with will actually have a lot of power over what the user thinks in a vote, for example. Yeah. So I'm gonna give like an example of one brick that I think could be useful, and I hope like we can come up with a lot of other things. So it's a thing I'm calling curated data streams. And this is basically using the threaded messaging system I was talking about before, where one user or multiple users can post to a linked list of data. So you can like verify that it's actually those users that have posted this data, and there's no central party that can like modify that data. So you can have one or multiple users that curate information, maybe about like the state of this room, or like how the quality of the road is, and feed that into this data stream. So by itself, that's just like trusting in that group of people or single person. But if you combine it with stuff like bonding curves, which someone was talking about before, you can actually use tokenized systems to curate which data streams are actually useful. Or you can actually use like a DAO with reputation to like curate the different data streams. So this is kind of like oracles are used now to get like financial data of the internet, but we need that to like get data from the real world into our DAOs, so we can actually make sensible sensible decisions about the world in our DAOs. And I think that's really important. So how will DAOs consume data? Back to the original question. Yeah, I think DAOs needs to consume data from like the core physical level up to the decision-making level. And we can't really, if we don't like verify as close as possible to the physical layer of the world, like we're gonna have problems. So we need to like get the verifiability down as close to the physical world as possible. And I think we can do that by start making these kind of sense-making Lego bricks. Cool. So if any of this sounded somewhat interesting, you should come and build with us. So at DAppCon, we're hosting a workshop for messaging applications. So we're using these threads to create like a simple messaging board and walk you through how to use them in a simple way. And at Berlin, we have a bunch of bounties where you will be rewarded to build cool dApps with 3Box. And you can use 3Box by using 3Box.js. We have an identity wallet SDK, which will allow wallets to use 3Box natively. And we have a doc site. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening.